The following morning brought grey skies and the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to soak into one's bones rather than merely dampen one's clothes, and Miss Marple found herself contemplating the peculiar nature of small-town life as she attended the village post office to collect her weekly parcel from her nephew Raymond's bookshop in London. It was there, surrounded by the familiar clutter of parcels, magazines, and the gentle gossiping of Mrs. Pemberton, the postmistress, that she first learned of Eleanor Hartwell's extraordinary decision, one that had apparently been made in the hours following yesterday's tea party and had already become the subject of considerable speculation throughout Little Cressington. Eleanor had dismissed the entire household staff save for David Ashworth, claiming financial uncertainties and the need to economize despite the obvious fact that her fortune remained entirely intact and visible in the form of new autumn plantings in the Thornfield Gardens and the recent repairs to the Manor's west wing. The dismissal had been particularly sudden, and notably included Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, the house steward, who had served the family for nearly 20 years, and who had been known for his absolute discretion and tireless dedication to maintaining the Manor's considerable operations. This information came from Mrs. Pemberton, who had heard it from the baker's wife, who had heard it from Miss Sarah Quinton, the village's only journalist, and a woman who made it her business to know everyone else's business before they had fully made the decision to conceal it. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully about this account was not the staff dismissals themselves. Financial retrenchment, however unnecessary in Eleanor's case, could always be justified by reference to uncertain times, but rather the specificity of David's retention and the obvious haste with which the arrangements had been made. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had positioned herself at the village green, ostensibly to examine the new plantings that the gardening committee had approved for the winter season, though in reality she was waiting for Margaret Thornton, the wife of the village solicitor, who typically walked from the post office to the market square at precisely 11 o'clock. Margaret arrived as predicted, her umbrella held at an angle against the drizzle, and within moments Miss Marple had engaged her in conversation about the weather, the state of the gardens, and eventually, with the kind of casual inevitability that characterized her methods, about Eleanor Hartwell's recent domestic arrangements. Margaret, whose position as the solicitor's wife gave her access to certain professional confidences while maintaining the expectation of discretion, was typically forthcoming about matters that seemed to her inconsequential but which Miss Marple understood as potentially significant. On this occasion, Margaret mentioned that Eleanor had visited her husband's office the previous evening requesting a modification to her will, a request that had struck both Margaret and her husband as peculiar, given that Eleanor's will had been revised only a year prior, and had seemed entirely satisfactory to all parties involved. The modification, Margaret said, with the kind of careful circumspection that suggested she was approaching the very limits of what could be discussed, appeared to concern the disposition of the Manor's contents and the rearrangement of certain trust provisions, though the specific details remained confidential between Eleanor and the solicitor. Miss Marple listened to this account with apparent interest focused on the garden plantings, while her mind performed the intricate calculations that had served her so well over decades of subtle investigation. Here was a woman who had dismissed her household on the day following an unexplained sound in her attic, had immediately altered her will in ways that required professional consultation, and had retained only her nephew, a man whom Miss Marple recalled as having lived in London for the past 3 years, engaged in some vague business endeavor that no one in the village seemed entirely certain about. The narrative being constructed suggested itself in troublingly clear outline. Either Eleanor was preparing for something to happen, or she was preparing for something that had already begun to unfold behind the Manor's stone walls. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage that afternoon, she had decided that a conversation with Eleanor Hartwell was required. Not the kind of interrogation that Scotland Yard might conduct, but rather the kind of gentle social visit that could be explained through the simple pretense of concern for an old friend's welfare following what must have surely been an upsetting household disruption. She composed a brief note suggesting that she had some excellent seed catalogues to share and would be delighted to take tea the following day, and dispatched it with young Thomas Wickham, the village boy who occasionally performed errands, with the kind of precise instructions that ensured it would reach Eleanor's hands before dinner time. She received Eleanor's acceptance before evening, written in Eleanor's careful, precise hand, expressing gratitude for the consideration and confirming that tomorrow at 3 o'clock would be entirely satisfactory. As Miss Marple prepared her knitting materials for the evening, selecting yarn in soft greys and blues for a pattern she had been developing, she found herself thinking about the nature of secrets and how they pressed upon those who held them, how they altered behavior in subtle ways that betrayed themselves to anyone patient enough to observe them. The footstep in the attic had been a beginning, she understood now, not an ending. A beginning of something whose full dimensions remained obscured, but whose inevitability had already been established by Eleanor's swift, decisive actions in the hours that followed. What she could not yet determine, and what the tea party tomorrow might illuminate, was whether Eleanor was the architect of whatever was occurring at Thornfield Manor, or merely its reluctant custodian, and whether the secrets being maintained within those stone walls were Eleanor's own, or whether she had been drawn into the confidences and necessities of someone else, someone for whom she was prepared to dismiss devoted servants and rewrite her will. The afternoon of Miss Marple's visit arrived with the peculiar clarity that sometimes follows persistent rain, and as she made her way up the drive to Thornfield Manor, she observed with her characteristic attention to detail that the grounds had acquired a certain air of neglect that suggested the absent gardening staff had not yet been replaced. This itself was informative. Eleanor had dismissed not only the indoor servants but also the groundskeeping team, a choice that spoke to either severe financial concerns or a desire to minimize the number of people present at the manor during a period when privacy seemed to have become a paramount concern. David Ashworth answered the door himself, displaying a courtesy that could not quite disguise the tautness around his eyes or the way his hand trembled fractionally as he took Miss Marple's coat and umbrella. Eleanor received her in the drawing-room, a space that seemed somehow diminished without the presence of the household staff, who typically maintained its perfection, and though Eleanor's smile was warm and her manner hospitable, Miss Marple detected in her a quality of profound exhaustion that no amount of composure could entirely mask. They settled into chairs positioned before the fireplace, where a modest fire burned with less vigor than such a room typically commanded, and Eleanor busied herself with the tea service with a domesticity that seemed unfamiliar to her, suggesting that the departure of the household staff had created practical difficulties beyond the mere matter of dismissal. Miss Marple presented the seed catalogues with appropriate ceremony, and they began the kind of gentle conversation that characterized such visits, observations about the weather, the state of the village, the upcoming Christmas season. But beneath this comfortable surface, Miss Marple was carefully observing Eleanor's reactions and the particular quality of her attention. It was during a discussion of the autumn plantings that Miss Marple, with studied casualness, remarked upon how difficult it must be to manage a property of Thornfield's size with reduced staff, a comment that produced in Eleanor a reaction far more pronounced than the simple social remark warranted. Eleanor's cup rattled against its saucer, and for just a moment her composure fractured sufficiently to reveal the profound anxiety that lay beneath her careful presentation. She recovered almost immediately, explaining that she had simply found herself overwhelmed by the expense of maintaining such a large household, and that David had been so very helpful in managing the transition, speaking his name in a manner that suggested she was reassuring herself of his loyalty even as she spoke the words aloud. This moment of vulnerability provided Miss Marple with precisely the opening she required, and she pivoted the conversation with apparent sympathy toward the challenges of managing finances and the particular difficulties that arose when one's circumstances shifted unexpectedly. She spoke, as she often did, in terms of her own experiences and those of people she had known, relating a story about a woman from her distant past who had found herself in financial straits and had been forced to make difficult decisions about household management and the retention of trusted employees. As she spoke, she watched Eleanor's face with the intensity of someone examining a complex mathematical equation, observing how Eleanor's eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond the drawing-room walls, as though she were looking not at the present, but into some previous moment or feared future that only she could perceive. When Eleanor finally responded, her words were carefully chosen, but they contained within them the seeds of a confession that she seemed unable entirely to suppress. She spoke of how sometimes one encountered situations that required one to make choices one had never anticipated making, choices that placed loyalty to family members in direct opposition to one's own principles and sense of what was right and proper. She mentioned, almost parenthetically, that David had been experiencing certain difficulties in London, difficulties of a financial nature that had necessitated his return to Little Cressington and had created circumstances that required a good deal of careful management and discretion. Miss Marple responded with sympathy and the kind of non-judgmental attentiveness that seemed to encourage Eleanor to continue, and though Eleanor did not reveal the specific nature of David's difficulties, the implications became increasingly apparent. It emerged through careful questioning that seemed to arise naturally from the conversation's organic flow that David had been involved in business ventures that had not proceeded as anticipated, that certain debts had accumulated, and that his sudden return to the manor had been motivated by necessity rather than choice. Furthermore, Eleanor hinted, with a kind of delicate circumlocution that suggested she was approaching territory she found deeply uncomfortable, that there were certain complications arising from David's previous residence in London, complications that involved other people and situations that had followed him to Little Cressington. It was at precisely this moment that Miss Marple asked, with the kind of innocent curiosity that seemed entirely consonant with the conversational flow, whether Eleanor's recent modification to her will was connected to these circumstances surrounding David, and whether Eleanor was perhaps concerned about the disposition of the manor and its contents in light of David's financial difficulties. Eleanor's response was not a direct answer, but rather a statement that one must sometimes consider the future and make provisions for situations that might arise unexpectedly, and that such provisions were simply the responsible actions of someone who cared deeply about maintaining family interests and ensuring that the manor and its contents remained secure. The conversation concluded shortly thereafter, with Eleanor expressing gratitude for Miss Marple's visit and her thoughtful attention, and as Miss Marple prepared to depart, David appeared to escort her to the door with a courtesy that seemed now to carry undertones of desperation. In the motor car on the return journey to the village, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the architecture of the situation with increasing clarity. Eleanor was protecting David from something, or perhaps protecting something from David, and the footstep in the attic had been connected to whatever arrangement Eleanor was attempting to maintain through the careful management of her household, her will, and her relationships with the people surrounding her. What remained unclear was whether David was the architect of whatever was being concealed or merely its most visible beneficiary, and whether the danger that seemed to permeate Thornfield Manor was directed toward Eleanor herself, or whether it emanated from her and threatened others. The revelation that Miss Marple had obtained through her carefully orchestrated conversation with Eleanor Hartwell seemed to settle into the fabric of Little Cressington over the following days, with the kind of quiet inevitability that characterized how village information circulated through the intricate networks of gossip and speculation that connected every household to every other. By the time Friday evening had arrived, nearly everyone in the village possessed some version of the story. That David Ashworth had returned from London in financial distress, that Eleanor had dismissed her household staff, that modifications to her will had been undertaken in circumstances that suggested urgency rather than the careful deliberation one typically associated with such legal matters. The narrative that emerged from these fragmentary pieces of information was one that seemed to satisfy the village's collective need for explanation, though Miss Marple found herself oddly dissatisfied with this neat arrangement of facts, sensing within it certain inconsistencies that others seemed content to overlook. It was on Friday afternoon, as Miss Marple was attending to her weekly shopping in the village market, that she encountered Victoria Hartwell, Eleanor's daughter-in-law, standing before the fruit and vegetable stall with the particular intensity of someone engaged in selecting items with unusual concentration. Victoria appeared diminished somehow, as though the vitality that had characterized her at the tea party had been gradually leached away by events subsequent to that afternoon, and her greeting to Miss Marple contained within it a note of desperation that suggested she was relieved to encounter someone who might listen without judgment. They progressed through the market together, and as they did so, Victoria began to speak in a manner that suggested she had been awaiting an opportunity to confide in someone trustworthy, and that Miss Marple's appearance had provided the catalyst for this confession. Victoria revealed that she had become increasingly concerned about Eleanor's well-being and state of mind, expressing worry that Eleanor was allowing herself to be manipulated by David, who had always been something of a disappointment to the family, but whose failings had apparently reached new dimensions during his London residence. Victoria spoke of her suspicions that David had become involved with people of questionable character, individuals who might be exerting pressure on both David and Eleanor in ways that neither was willing to acknowledge openly. More troublingly, Victoria mentioned that she had observed unusual activities at Thornfield Manor in the evenings, occasions when she had driven past the manor house and noticed lights in the upper windows, particularly in the attic region, at hours when the house should have been entirely dark and its occupants asleep. She had additionally noticed, on several occasions, the arrival of motor cars at the manor late in the evening, vehicles that departed within an hour, and that did not bear the markings of tradespersons or service providers. This information, delivered in a low voice and with frequent glances around to ensure they were not being overheard, seemed to Miss Marple to constitute corroboration of her own growing suspicions, though it raised new questions that complicated rather than clarified the essential mystery. After Victoria had departed with her purchases, Miss Marple found herself standing quite still among the market bustle, her mind operating at the accelerated pace that characterized her most intense periods of analytical thought. The activities in the attic, the dismissal of the household staff, the modifications to Eleanor's will, David's financial difficulties, and now the evening visits of motor cars, all seemed to point toward an arrangement that involved not merely David's private financial problems, but rather some form of organized activity that required secrecy and coordination. The most obvious explanation, and the one that seemed to be emerging in village speculation, was that David was engaged in criminal enterprise, smuggling perhaps, or some form of black market activity that had brought him back to Little Cressington and had drawn Eleanor into his criminal enterprise either through coercion or through maternal affection that superseded her moral judgment. Yet even this explanation seemed to Miss Marple to contain certain logical gaps and inconsistencies that prevented her from accepting it entirely. If David were engaged in criminal activity of a conventional sort, Eleanor's modifications to her will seemed unnecessary and irrational, unless she feared that her death was imminent, a fear that would only arise if David himself represented a threat to her survival. Additionally, the careful nature of Eleanor's protection of David, the specific retention of his services while dismissing all other household staff, suggested not criminal enterprise but rather a situation of such profound delicacy that Eleanor had concluded that fewer witnesses were preferable to any witnesses at all. It was this last consideration that prompted Miss Marple to seek out Reverend Whitmore on Saturday morning, a man whose pastoral position gave him access to confidences and whose integrity had never been questioned, even in a village where integrity was frequently compromised by the demands of social advancement and personal interest. She posed to him, with appropriate vagueness and framed as a hypothetical question arising from her meditations on human nature, whether he had observed any unusual behaviors or expressions of distress among his parishioners that might suggest circumstances beyond the surface explanations that had been offered. The Reverend, a man of considerable perception despite his occasional tendency toward naivete, revealed that he had noticed Eleanor seemed unusually anxious during her recent attendance at services, that she had avoided conversation with her usual circle of acquaintances, and that on one occasion he had encountered her seemingly distressed in the churchyard, though she had composed herself rapidly upon his approach, and offered no explanation for her evident emotional state. More significantly, The Reverend mentioned that David had not attended services at all since his return to Little Cressington, a notable deviation from what would be expected of a man maintaining his position as a respected member of the community. As Miss Marple walked back through the village toward her cottage, she found herself arriving at a provisional conclusion that seemed to her to carry greater weight and probability than the criminal enterprise theory that had captured village imagination. The situation at Thornfield Manor seemed to suggest not criminality in the conventional sense, but rather a medical or psychological crisis of such magnitude that Eleanor deemed it necessary to maintain absolute privacy while managing it with minimal assistance. The attic sounds, the dismissed staff, the retained nephew, the evening visitors, and the modifications to Eleanor's will all seemed compatible with a scenario in which Eleanor was managing some form of medical emergency or mental health crisis that required both secrecy and carefully orchestrated assistance, and that David, whatever his financial difficulties might be, had been positioned at the manor to facilitate this management. The weekend passed with the kind of autumnal quietude that characterized Little Cressington during the transition between seasons, though Miss Marple found herself unable to achieve her customary contentment with knitting and the gentle rhythms of village life, her mind instead persisting in the construction and deconstruction of various hypotheses regarding the circumstances at Thornfield Manor. By Monday morning, she had concluded that passive observation, however subtle and refined, had reached the limits of its usefulness, and that some form of more direct investigation was required if she were to progress beyond speculation toward understanding. The opportunity for such investigation presented itself through the mechanism of the village lending library, a small but respectable collection of books maintained by Miss Sarah Quinton, the journalist whose appetite for information seemed to extend beyond mere social gossip into territory that suggested genuine investigative instinct. Miss Quinton, who ran the library from a room adjacent to her office at the Little Cressington Gazette, had always possessed an unusual combination of professional discretion regarding published material and remarkable forthcomingness regarding unpublished observations, and she was known throughout the village as someone who noticed details that others overlooked and who maintained a surprisingly extensive network of contacts beyond the boundaries of the village. Proper. Miss Marple visited the library on Monday afternoon, ostensibly to return several books and to inquire about new acquisitions, but in reality to engage Miss Quinton in conversation regarding David Ashworth and to ascertain whether her journalistic connections had provided her with information about his activities in London prior to his return to Little Cressington. Miss Quinton, perched behind a desk that seemed permanently buried beneath manuscript pages and correspondence, looked up at Miss Marple's entrance with the particular brightness that characterized her when she sensed the possibility of gathering intelligence, and within moments Miss Marple had situated herself in the chair opposite and had begun the careful conversational dance that would hopefully elicit the information she sought. The initial exchanges concerned the lending library's new acquisitions and the upcoming Christmas season, topics sufficiently mundane to establish the legitimate reason for her visit. But as the conversation progressed, Miss Marple introduced, with apparent casualness, the observation that young people such as David Ashworth often found London society rather demanding, and that she had often wondered whether he had found the transition back to village life difficult. This seemingly innocent observation prompted Miss Quinton, who apparently had been awaiting permission to discuss her findings, to reveal that she had indeed made inquiries regarding David's London residence through contacts at the Gazette's London office, and that what she had discovered was rather more complex than the simple financial difficulties that village speculation had attributed to him. David, according to these inquiries, had been involved in several business ventures that had failed, but the failures themselves seemed less significant than the manner in which they had occurred and the individuals with whom he had been associated. He had maintained associations with individuals whose reputations extended into rather murky territory, though nothing definitively criminal could be established, and there were suggestions that he had become involved with individuals of questionable character through circumstances that were themselves unclear but that seemed to have generated some form of obligation or debt beyond the merely financial. Most significantly, Miss Quinton revealed, David had apparently been involved with a woman in London, a relationship that had ended in circumstances that remained obscure, but that seemed to have precipitated his somewhat abrupt departure from the city and his return to Little Cressington and the protection of his aunt's household. The woman in question, Miss Quinton explained with some delicacy, had been married to a man of significant wealth and questionable character, a man whose business interests encompassed territory that suggested connections to organized criminal enterprises, though again nothing definitive could be proven. When the affair had come to the attention of the woman's husband, there had apparently been consequences, of an unspecified but clearly serious nature, consequences that had prompted David's rapid departure from London and his retreat to the relative safety of the village and Eleanor's manor house. This revelation, while appearing at first to reinforce the theory that David had brought criminal entanglement to Eleanor's doorstep, instead seemed to Miss Marple to suggest a different and more troubling possibility. If David had been involved with the wife of a dangerous man, and if that involvement had ended in a manner that necessitated his departure from London and his retreat to Eleanor's protection, then the evening visits to Thornfield Manor that Victoria had observed might represent not David's criminal enterprises, but rather the consequence of his previous romantic entanglement. Visits from individuals connected to the woman he had been involved with, or worse, visits from the woman herself, or from representatives of her husband seeking to pursue grievances or extract retribution. The modifications to Eleanor's will became, in light of this information, not merely the rearrangement of financial provisions, but potentially the documentation of Eleanor's decision to financially secure David's position regardless of what might befall her, a decision that would suggest Eleanor herself might be in danger due to her relationship with and protection of her nephew. After leaving Miss Quinton's library, Miss Marple found herself navigating the village streets with a sense of urgency that she typically kept carefully concealed beneath her exterior of genteel contemplation. The situation had escalated in her mind from a matter of mysterious household arrangements and financial difficulties to something substantially more dangerous, something that might involve not merely David's personal crisis, but Eleanor's physical safety, and the possibility that whatever was occurring at Thornfield Manor represented an active threat to her well-being. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her cottage with her knitting needles clicking their familiar rhythm, she made a decision that represented a departure from her customary methods. She composed a brief letter to her old friend and distant cousin, Inspector Gerald Craddock of Scotland Yard, not with accusations or explicit statements of her concerns, but rather with what appeared to be innocent questions about general matters of security and the appropriate procedures one might follow if one believed oneself to be under threat from individuals beyond the scope of local police authority. She posted the letter that same evening, understanding that while she could not yet prove her suspicions, the accumulation of seemingly innocent details had constructed a pattern that demanded acknowledgement and investigation by authorities with resources beyond those available to a village constable. The response from Inspector Craddock arrived on Wednesday morning in the form of a brief but characteristically astute letter that suggested he had understood the substance of Miss Marple's inquiry beneath its surface presentation of innocent questioning, and that he was prepared to investigate the circumstances at Thornfield Manor should Miss Marple provide him with additional specificity regarding her concerns. This correspondence, delivered by the regular post and therefore visible to the village's extensive network of observers, provided Miss Marple with both relief and a renewed sense of urgency, for the involvement of Scotland Yard resources would inevitably become a matter of public knowledge that would alter the dynamics at Thornfield Manor and might precipitate events rather than merely illuminating them. It was therefore with considerable calculation that Miss Marple determined to visit Thornfield Manor once more before official inquiries could be initiated, reasoning that Eleanor might be more forthcoming if she understood that outside authorities were preparing to investigate, and that Eleanor might be induced to reveal information that she had previously kept concealed if she believed that such revelation might actually serve to protect rather than endanger her interests. The weather on Thursday morning had turned distinctly cold, with frost coating the village in shades of silver and grey, and as Miss Marple made her way toward Thornfield Manor, she observed that the grounds appeared if anything more neglected than they had during her previous visit, with dead leaves accumulating in drifts along the drive and the flow. Beds, showing the sad deterioration of abandonment. David answered the door once more, but on this occasion his appearance had deteriorated noticeably. His eyes were shadowed with what appeared to be sustained sleep deprivation. His manner was considerably more agitated, and he seemed unsurprised to see Miss Marple, suggesting that some form of communication regarding her intended visit must have preceded her arrival. Eleanor received her in the drawing-room, where a more substantial fire now burned, though the room itself seemed diminished by Eleanor's own apparent diminishment, her figure appearing somehow smaller than Miss Marple recalled, her face bearing the particular pallor that suggested either illness or the effects of profound and sustained anxiety. The social pleasantries that typically characterized such visits were abbreviated to the point of near non-existence, Eleanor's courtesy giving way almost immediately to a kind of desperate inquiry regarding the nature of Miss Marple's visit and the particular concerns that had prompted it. Miss Marple, recognizing that Eleanor had reached a point where further dissimulation would be counterproductive, abandoned her customary oblique methods and spoke with direct gentleness regarding what she had learned through her inquiries, that David had been involved with a woman in London, that this involvement had generated consequences, and that Eleanor's recent household arrangements and modifications to her will suggested she was attempting to manage a situation that extended beyond David's mere financial difficulties. Eleanor's response was not immediate, and for several moments she sat quite still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused upon some invisible point beyond the room's physical boundaries, as though she were conducting some final internal negotiation regarding what she was prepared to reveal. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but conveyed the quality of someone who had exhausted her capacity for maintaining pretense, and who had arrived at the conclusion that disclosure might actually represent relief, rather than further danger. She confirmed that David had indeed been involved with a married woman in London, and that when the affair had been discovered, the woman's husband, a man named Marcus Vellacott, who apparently maintained extensive business interests and associations with individuals of genuinely criminal character, had made it clear that David's continued residence in London would result in consequences of a severe and probably permanent nature. David had therefore fled to Little Cressington and to Eleanor's protection, arriving at the manor in a state of profound distress and fear that Eleanor described as having seemed almost like derangement. Eleanor had taken him in despite the obvious complications this created, motivated by maternal affection for her late son's child, and by her belief that David, whatever his failings, did not deserve to be subjected to the kind of violence that Vellacott was apparently prepared to inflict upon him. However, Eleanor continued, the situation had not remained contained within the manor's walls, for Vellacott apparently had resources sufficient to locate David's whereabouts, and approximately 2 weeks prior, around the time of the tea party that had first alerted Miss Marple to unusual circumstances, there had been an initial contact at Thornfield Manor from individuals clearly associated with Vellacott. These individuals had come ostensibly to negotiate David's resolution of his financial obligations to Vellacott and to discuss the matter of the woman he had been involved with, but Eleanor understood with perfect clarity that the visit was actually an intimidation tactic designed to demonstrate Vellacott's ability. Thank you to reach David, even in his supposed sanctuary. It was during this visit, Eleanor revealed, that the footstep had been heard in the attic, for the individuals had demanded to search the manor to ensure David was actually present and was not attempting to evade their contact through deception. Eleanor had permitted the search, fearing that refusal would result in more violent action, and the sounds that Miss Marple and the other tea party guests had heard were the consequences of that search being conducted in the upper reaches of the house. Since that occasion, Eleanor explained, the situation had only intensified. For David had become increasingly unstable under the stress of his situation. The visits had continued on multiple occasions, each time with the implicit suggestion that violence was approaching if the matter were not resolved, and Eleanor had made the modifications to her will because she had begun to fear that events might reach a point where she herself might become collateral damage in whatever confrontation eventually occurred. The most troubling element of Eleanor's account, however, was her revelation that she had begun to receive communications that suggested Velicott was no longer satisfied with mere intimidation and was preparing to move toward more direct and violent action, and that she believed the situation at Thornfield Manor had reached a critical point where the outcome might very well involve genuine harm to someone, possibly including herself or David, or potentially someone from the village who became inadvertently involved. As Eleanor spoke these final words, Miss Marple observed David standing in the doorway, his face bearing an expression of such profound despair and guilt that she understood immediately the depth of his awareness regarding the danger he had brought into Eleanor's life, and the extent to which this awareness was eroding what remained of his psychological stability. Miss Marple's departure from Thornfield Manor that Thursday afternoon was accomplished with a kind of purposeful efficiency that masked the profound urgency that had seized her understanding of the situation's critical nature, and by the time she had reached the village, she had already composed in her mind the contents of a second and considerably more explicit letter to Inspector Craddock detailing the specific threats that Eleanor and David faced, and the probable timeline within which those threats might be translated into violent action. However, before Miss Marple could commit this letter to post, circumstances intervened in a manner that seemed to accelerate events beyond the careful pace that investigation and official procedure typically required. For it was at approximately 4 o'clock that same afternoon that the first genuine crisis manifested itself in the form of a motor car arriving at the village police station with sufficient urgency to draw the attention of nearly everyone engaged in business along the village high street. The motor car contained Victoria Hartwell, who was in a state of considerable distress, and who reported to Constable Hartley, the village's sole representative of law enforcement and a man of limited investigative capacity but genuine integrity, that she had observed suspicious individuals loitering near Thornfield Manor, and that she believed Eleanor was in immediate danger. This report, while not containing sufficient specificity to constitute actionable evidence in the formal sense, was treated by Constable Hartley with the seriousness it demanded, and he immediately contacted the regional police headquarters to request assistance and guidance regarding the situation. Miss Marple, learning of these developments through the village's remarkably efficient gossip networks, recognized that the situation had now entered a phase where official investigation would proceed regardless of her own preferred timeline, and that the delicate balance she had been attempting to maintain between protecting Eleanor's privacy and securing her safety had been decisively disrupted by Victoria's intervention. She therefore took the unusual step of visiting the police station directly and requesting a private conversation with Constable Hartley, during which she provided him with the information that Eleanor had confided to her regarding David's circumstances and the threats posed by Marcus Velicott and his associates. Constable Hartley, a man of generally sound judgment despite his limited resources, recognized immediately that the situation extended beyond his capacity to manage independently and contacted Scotland Yard directly, requesting that Inspector Craddock himself be assigned to investigate given Miss Marple's evident involvement and her established reputation for reliable assessment of complex situations. Inspector Craddock arrived in Little Cressington late that same evening, having driven from London with a small team of colleagues, and his first action upon arrival was to establish a discreet surveillance operation around Thornfield Manor, while simultaneously conducting preliminary interviews with Eleanor, David, and the various other individuals who possessed knowledge of the situation. It was during these interviews that evening that the investigation took an unexpected and genuinely troubling turn, for when Inspector Craddock attempted to obtain detailed descriptions of the individuals who had visited Thornfield Manor on behalf of Velicott, Eleanor was unable to provide sufficiently specific information to enable proper identification. And when he consulted with David regarding these same visitors, David's descriptions were vague and internally inconsistent in ways that suggested either profound trauma-induced memory distortion or something more deliberately evasive. Furthermore, when Inspector Craddock conducted preliminary inquiries into Marcus Velicott himself, he discovered that while Velicott was indeed a known associate of criminal elements, there existed no substantive evidence that he had personally authorized or was even aware of any threats directed toward David Ashworth, and that according to London police sources, Vellicott's attention had for the past several weeks been directed toward entirely different enterprises and individuals. This discrepancy between Eleanor's account of systematic intimidation by Vellicott's representatives and the apparent reality of Vellicott's lack of active interest in David's situation struck Inspector Craddock with sufficient force to prompt him to conduct a more thorough and critical reassessment of Eleanor's narrative, a reassessment that he communicated to Miss Marple in a private conversation late that evening in her cottage. The inspector, settling into Miss Marple's sitting room with the kind of easy familiarity that characterized his relationship with her, expressed his growing doubt regarding whether Eleanor's account was entirely truthful, or whether she might be deliberately constructing a narrative designed to obscure the actual nature of what had been occurring at Thornfield Manor. The visits that Victoria had observed, the modifications to Eleanor's will, the dismissal of household staff, and the sounds in the attic might all represent something entirely different from the situation Eleanor had described, and the threat that had precipitated Eleanor's apparent crisis might originate from an entirely different source, or might itself be a fabrication designed to accomplish some other purpose entirely. It was at this point that Miss Marple found herself compelled to articulate the conclusions that her own analytical processes had been constructing with increasing clarity, even as she had been accepting Eleanor's account on its surface. For while Eleanor's narrative had contained sufficient internal coherence to seem plausible, it had also contained certain logical inconsistencies that had troubled her deeply, but which she had been inclined to attribute to emotional distress rather than deliberate deception. She outlined to Inspector Craddock her growing suspicion that Eleanor might not be the victim in this situation, but rather its architect, that the mysterious activities at Thornfield Manor might not represent attempts to conceal David from Vellicott, but rather might represent something Eleanor was attempting to accomplish through David's cooperation or complicity, and that the modifications to Eleanor's will, the dismissal of staff, and the entire structure of Eleanor's careful arrangements might represent not protection, but rather the preparation for some action that Eleanor had determined to undertake, and for which she required David's involvement and the village's continued misunderstanding of the true nature of events. As Miss Marple articulated these suspicions aloud, she became increasingly aware that she was not merely engaging in abstract analytical speculation, but rather was arriving at conclusions that carried genuinely troubling implications. Conclusions that suggested that whatever was occurring at Thornfield Manor represented not a threat to Eleanor, but rather a threat that Eleanor herself had created, or was preparing to create, and that the real danger might not be directed toward Eleanor at all, but rather toward someone entirely different, someone who might not yet understand that they stood in the path of Eleanor Hartwell's carefully orchestrated intentions. Inspector Craddock's response to Miss Marple's articulation of her suspicions was not immediate dismissal, but rather the kind of thoughtful silence that characterized his approach to complex investigative problems, and as he sat in Miss Marple's cottage with the firelight casting shadows across his features, she observed in his expression the particular quality of someone reassessing everything he had learned through the lens of an entirely new interpretive framework. After several moments of contemplation, the inspector rose from his chair and began to pace the small sitting room in the manner of someone attempting to organize accumulating data into a coherent pattern, and when he finally spoke, it was with the kind of careful precision that suggested he was articulating conclusions he had only partially acknowledged to himself. He began by noting that Eleanor's entire account had been constructed around the central premise, that she was a victim of circumstances beyond her control, circumstances created by David's romantic entanglement and subsequent flight from London, but that this framework contained within it certain structural improbabilities that became increasingly apparent upon closer examination. The modifications to Eleanor's will, for instance, seemed oddly specific in ways that suggested not merely the rearrangement of financial provisions, but rather the deliberate establishment of conditions that would benefit David substantially, while simultaneously creating legal documentation of Eleanor's intentions regarding specific assets and properties. Furthermore, the dismissal of household staff had been sufficiently comprehensive and sufficiently swift to suggest not economy, but rather the deliberate creation of a situation where Eleanor had minimal witnesses to her activities. And the retention of David, a young man with apparently no experience in household management, suggested not practical necessity but rather the deliberate maintenance of a confidant who shared knowledge of whatever Eleanor was attempting to accomplish. What troubled the inspector most significantly, however, was that when he had inquired regarding the identity of the individuals who had supposedly visited Thornfield Manor on behalf of Vellacott, Eleanor had been unable to provide descriptions sufficiently specific to enable identification. And when he had pressed her on this point, she had become evasive in ways that suggested either deliberate deception or a profound unwillingness to provide information she possessed. This evasiveness had prompted the inspector to make preliminary inquiries regarding Eleanor's financial circumstances, inquiries that had revealed that despite her substantial inherited wealth, Eleanor had recently made a series of financial transactions that seemed oddly inconsistent with the economizing she claimed to be undertaking, including the purchase of insurance policies that specified David as the beneficiary and the establishment of trust funds with conditions that suggested Eleanor was attempting to secure specific assets for David's eventual use. It was at this point that Miss Marple found herself articulating a suspicion that had been forming at the periphery of her consciousness throughout her investigation, a suspicion that seemed to her both logical and deeply troubling in its implications. What if the situation at Thornfield Manor was not concerned with David at all, she proposed, but rather with Eleanor's relationship with her son's widow, Victoria, a woman who had been absent from Thornfield Manor for an extended period and who had therefore not been present to observe directly the activities that Eleanor had been orchestrating. Victoria, Miss Marple noted, stood to inherit Thornfield Manor and its considerable contents upon Eleanor's death, an inheritance that would revert to Eleanor's own family or to David's control if Victoria were somehow to precede Eleanor in death, or if Eleanor were to modify her will to exclude Victoria entirely. What if Eleanor, for reasons that might range from resentment of Victoria to some form of psychological disturbance, had been attempting to construct circumstances that would result in Victoria's death while establishing in advance the narrative that would explain this death as an external threat emanating from Vellacott and London, rather than from Eleanor's own deliberate action? The inspector's response to this hypothesis was not immediate acceptance, but rather a kind of cautious acknowledgement of its logical possibility, coupled with the observation that it represented a theory that would require very substantial evidence to support, for it implied not merely criminal behavior, but premeditated murder, constructed with extraordinary care and psychological sophistication. Nevertheless, Inspector Craddock's demeanor suggested that Miss Marple's hypothesis had articulated something he had himself begun to suspect, and he rose from his chair with renewed purpose, stating his intention to conduct a more thorough investigation of the financial arrangements Eleanor had established and to undertake a detailed examination of Thornfield Manor itself for evidence that might suggest Eleanor had been preparing not to receive threats, but rather to create an opportunity for violence to occur. As the inspector prepared to depart, Miss Marple found herself moved to voice one additional observation, one that arose from her lifetime of observation regarding the particular psychology of women who contemplated such acts. Eleanor, she suggested, was not a woman who had suddenly conceived of murdering her daughter-in-law in a moment of passion or resentment, but rather someone who had long harbored some form of grievance or psychological wound regarding Victoria, some offense that had accumulated across years until it had achieved sufficient emotional weight to justify in Eleanor's mind the extraordinary measures she was now undertaking. If the inspector could identify the source of this grievance, the original wound that had transformed Eleanor from a woman of apparent respectability into someone capable of orchestrating murder, then the entire structure of Eleanor's carefully constructed narrative might collapse, revealing the true nature of her intentions and the genuine danger that Victoria faced. The inspector departed Miss Marple's cottage shortly thereafter, and as Miss Marple watched him navigate the dark village streets toward Thornfield Manor, she found herself overwhelmed by a sensation of profound unease, for she had articulated her suspicions into concrete form, had translated her analytical observations into a formal hypothesis of murder and premeditation, and by doing so, she had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return to comfortable uncertainty or therapeutic doubt. The night that followed Inspector Craddock's departure from Miss Marple's cottage was one of considerable activity at Thornfield Manor. Though the precise nature of this activity remained obscured from the village by the careful discretion with which the inspector conducted his investigation and the deliberate concealment he maintained regarding the direction his suspicions had taken. By morning, however, circumstances had intervened in a manner that transformed speculation into urgent crisis, for it was discovered that Eleanor Hartwell had disappeared from Thornfield Manor sometime during the hours between midnight and dawn, having apparently departed the house through a side entrance and left behind only a brief note addressed to David indicating that she had gone to attend to matters requiring her immediate attention and that she would return within the day. This disappearance, communicated to Miss Marple by Inspector Craddock in a tense conversation at the police station early Friday morning, seemed to the inspector to represent either a panicked flight prompted by the investigative attention she had attracted or the final phase of whatever plan Eleanor had been constructing with such care across the preceding weeks. More troublingly, when Inspector Craddock had conducted a thorough search of Thornfield Manor during the night hours, he had discovered in the attic a quantity of materials that seemed entirely inconsistent with Eleanor's claim that the attic had merely been searched by Vellicott's representatives. Materials that included detailed floor plans of the village, schedules of Victoria's movements and activities, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be preliminary notes regarding the arrangement and timing of some form of accident that would result in Victoria's death, and that would appear to be consequence of circumstances beyond Eleanor's control or intention. The discovery of these materials had confirmed beyond reasonable doubt that Miss Marple's hypothesis regarding Eleanor's intentions was essentially correct, though the full scope of Eleanor's planning and the precise nature of the accident she had been contemplating remained unclear from the materials themselves. Inspector Craddock's immediate concern, therefore, was to locate Eleanor before she could accomplish whatever final actions she had determined to undertake, and to simultaneously warn Victoria of the danger she faced and ensure her protection against Eleanor's intentions. It was at this critical juncture that Miss Marple found herself compelled to engage in an action that departed substantially from her customary methods and represented an active intervention in investigative processes rather than the passive observation and subtle suggestion that typically characterized her involvement in such matters. She requested permission to visit David Ashworth at Thornfield Manor, reasoning that David, despite his complicity in Eleanor's deceptions regarding Vellicott and the fabricated threats, might still possess information regarding Eleanor's likely movements and the specific nature of the accident she had been planning to orchestrate. Inspector Craddock, recognizing the logic of this approach and understanding that David might be more forthcoming with Miss Marple than with official investigators, granted permission for this visit with the understanding that Miss Marple would report fully whatever information David provided. When Miss Marple arrived at Thornfield Manor that Friday morning, she found David in a state of profound psychological disintegration, his earlier evasiveness replaced by a kind of desperate desire to unburden himself of the knowledge he possessed regarding his aunt's true I, intentions and the role he had been manipulated into playing within Eleanor's carefully constructed scheme. David revealed that Eleanor had confided in him regarding her resentment of Victoria, a resentment that apparently originated from events predating even David's own birth, events that had involved Victoria's mother and Eleanor's late husband in a romantic entanglement that had resulted in considerable pain and humiliation for Eleanor. Eleanor had carried this resentment across decades, David explained, watching as Victoria had become the wife of her late son and the heir to substantial portions of Eleanor's estate, and this watching had apparently transformed the ancient wound into something more active and more poisonous, until Eleanor had concluded that Victoria's death was necessary both as revenge for ancient injuries and as a means of ensuring that the Hartwell family fortune and property would revert to David and potentially to Eleanor's own family line, rather than remaining under Victoria's control. The specific accident that Eleanor had been planning, David revealed with evident distress, was to be engineered during the upcoming Christmas season, when Victoria typically attended the village Christmas pageant at the church. Eleanor had apparently discovered a means of loosening the chandelier that hung above the church central nave, creating circumstances under which the chandelier would inevitably fall during the pageant, and Victoria, who customarily sat directly beneath this chandelier as a member of the church council, would be struck and almost certainly killed by the falling fixture. The accident would appear to be the consequence of structural failure and poor maintenance, and Eleanor had apparently already arranged for certain documentation to be discovered that would suggest the church's negligence in maintaining the fixture, documentation that would direct suspicion away from Eleanor entirely and toward the church authorities and maintenance personnel. David's revelation of this plan, delivered in halting and frequently interrupted statements that suggested he was struggling against both his own guilt and his continuing emotional attachment to his aunt, provided Inspector Craddock with the specificity he required to proceed with Eleanor's arrest and to begin construction of the legal case that would establish her guilt beyond reasonable doubt. More immediately, it allowed for the implementation of protective measures, ensuring that Victoria would be warned of the danger she faced, and that the Christmas pageant could proceed with the necessary precautions against Eleanor's intended violence. As Miss Marple listened to David's account and observed the genuine anguish that accompanied his confession of his complicity in his aunt's deception, she found herself confronted with the peculiar tragedy that so often accompanied her investigations. The reality that those involved in criminal acts were rarely entirely villainous, but rather were frequently individuals whose own wounds and psychological damage had motivated them toward actions that seemed to them justifiable or necessary, even as those actions inflicted profound harm upon others and upon themselves. Eleanor Hartwell was discovered late Friday afternoon at a small hotel in the market town of Ashford, approximately 15 miles from Little Cressington, where she had apparently checked in under an assumed name and had spent the preceding hours in a state of what the hotel manager described as anxious agitation, making and receiving telephone calls of an urgent nature and seemingly engaged in some form of internal struggle regarding a decision she had apparently not yet finalized. Inspector Craddock's officers apprehended her without incident, though Eleanor's demeanor upon arrest was characterized less by defiance or panic than by a kind of weary resignation, as though she had anticipated this eventuality and had perhaps even welcomed it as a resolution to the internal conflict that had clearly been tormenting her throughout the preceding days. When questioned formally at the police station, Eleanor initially maintained a posture of complete denial regarding the materials discovered in the attic and the allegations that she had been planning Victoria's death, but this denial persisted only until she was confronted with David's confession and with the detailed documentation of her financial transactions, her procurement of the necessary materials, and her extensive surveillance of Victoria's movements and habits. At that point, Eleanor's resistance seemed to collapse entirely, and she entered into a lengthy and remarkably detailed confession that provided Inspector Craddock with a comprehensive account of her motivations, her planning, and the psychological processes through which she had arrived at the conclusion that murdering her daughter-in-law was not merely justified but necessary. Eleanor's account of her grievance against Victoria and Victoria's family extended back across nearly 50 years, encompassing the romantic entanglement between Eleanor's late husband and Victoria's mother, an affair that had been conducted with sufficient indiscretion to become known throughout the village, and that had resulted in considerable public humiliation for Eleanor, at a time when such humiliation was profound and lasting in its social consequences. Eleanor had never divorced her husband, having been constrained by the social expectations of her era and her own religious convictions, and she had therefore endured decades of marriage to a man who had been unfaithful and who had demonstrated his infidelity through his obvious affect. Ion for Victoria's mother, and through the subsequent birth of Victoria's mother's child, which Eleanor had always suspected, though never proven, to be the biological child of Eleanor's own husband, rather than the child of Victoria's mother's husband. The emergence of Victoria as the wife of Eleanor's son and the principal heir to Eleanor's considerable estate had apparently reactivated all of Eleanor's ancient resentment and grief, transforming what might have remained as historical wound into active and poisonous present grievance. Eleanor had come to view Victoria's presence at Thornfield Manor as an intolerable intrusion and an insult to Eleanor's own position and dignity, and she had apparently concluded that the removal of Victoria through what would appear to be an accident was the only resolution that could restore proper order to Eleanor's world and ensure that the Hartwell estate and property remained under the control of individuals whom Eleanor deemed worthy of stewardship. What emerged most strikingly from Eleanor's confession, however, was not merely the content of her grievance or the specificity of her planning, but rather the evidence it contained of Eleanor's own profound psychological disturbance and her apparent inability to recognize the irrationality and moral depravity of her intentions, even as she articulated them clearly to Inspector Craddock and the attending officers. Eleanor spoke of her planned murder of Victoria in language that suggested she viewed it not as a crime, but rather as a necessary correction, a restoration of proper order, and a justified response to injuries that had been inflicted upon her decades earlier. She appeared genuinely to believe that she was the victim in this situation, and that Victoria's death would represent not a tragedy, but rather a restoration of justice and proper balance to circumstances that had been dissed, altered by historical events beyond Eleanor's control or responsibility. As Inspector Craddock communicated the contents of Eleanor's confession to Miss Marple during a late Friday evening meeting at the police station, he expressed his own profound disquiet regarding Eleanor's psychological state and his conviction that Eleanor's actions represented not merely the consequence of resentment and grievance, but rather the manifestation of a serious mental illness that had apparently been developing and intensifying across the decades of Eleanor's life. The inspector indicated his belief that Eleanor would require not merely criminal prosecution, but also comprehensive psychological evaluation and treatment, and that the case would likely involve consideration of whether Eleanor was competent to stand trial, or whether she should instead be remanded to psychiatric care, in recognition of her apparent inability to distinguish between rational grievance and delusional justification for violence. Miss Marple's response to this assessment was characteristically thoughtful and delivered with the particular quality of sadness that accompanied her most penetrating insights into human nature. She noted that Eleanor's case represented not an uncommon pattern in her experience, that individuals who had suffered genuine injuries and humiliation often developed across time an increasingly distorted interpretation of those injuries, allowing grievance to metastasize into something approaching psychological derangement if it remained unaddressed and if the individual involved possessed sufficient isolation to construct an entirely subjective narrative regarding their circumstances and their rights. Eleanor, Miss Marple suggested, had apparently never discussed her resentment of Victoria with anyone capable of offering perspective or contradiction, had never sought counsel or support that might have allowed for processing and resolution of her ancient wound, and had instead allowed her grievance to develop in isolation until it had achieved sufficient psychological weight to justify in Eleanor's mind the commission of premeditated murder. The tragedy, Miss Marple concluded, was that Eleanor's suffering was real and that her original injury had been genuine, but that her response to this suffering had been to inflict greater suffering upon an innocent party rather than to seek healing or resolution through more constructive means. As Miss Marple departed the police station that evening and made her way through the darkened village streets toward her cottage, she found herself reflecting upon the nature of justice and whether Eleanor's prosecution and potential imprisonment would constitute justice, or merely a perpetuation of the cycle of suffering and damage that had begun with Eleanor's own humiliation decades earlier. Christmas season arrived in Little Cressington with a kind of picturesque beauty that seemed designed to mock the darker truths that had emerged regarding Eleanor Hartwell and the circumstances that had unfolded within Thornfield Manor's stone walls. And as the village prepared for the annual Christmas pageant, there existed beneath the surface cheerfulness a kind of collective unease regarding the proximity of violence and the fragility of the social order that typically maintained the appearance of civilized tranquility. Victoria Hartwell, released from immediate danger and provided with comprehensive security arrangements by Inspector Craddock's officers, had initially expressed a desire to depart Little Cressington entirely and to establish residence elsewhere, but she had gradually come to understand through quiet conversations with various village members that to do so would be to accept Eleanor's version of events. To concede that Eleanor's resentment was somehow justified, or that Victoria herself bore responsibility for the circumstances that had generated Eleanor's murderous intentions. Victoria therefore determined to attend the Christmas pageant, as she had attended every Christmas pageant for the preceding 2 decades, and she took her customary position in the church nave, though with the knowledge that above her head the chandelier that Eleanor had attempted to sabotage had been thoroughly inspected, reinforced, and rendered entirely incapable of falling, regardless of Eleanor's machinations. Miss Marple attended the pageant as well, taking her usual seat in the rear of the church where she could observe the proceedings and the reactions of the assembled parishioners, and as she watched the familiar scenes of the Nativity unfold before her, she found her attention drawn not to the performance itself, but rather to the expressions and behaviors of those around her, particularly to David Ashworth, who sat in isolation several rows forward, and whose demeanor suggested someone struggling to reconcile his love for his aunt with his recognition of her fundamental moral culpability. The pageant concluded without incident, the chandelier remaining firmly secured to the ceiling, and as the parishioners filed from the church into the cold December evening, there occurred one of those moments that seemed to Miss Marple to represent the culmination not merely of the investigation, but of the deeper moral and psychological processes that had animated the entire sequence of events. Eleanor Hartwell had been granted temporary release from custody pending trial, a decision that had generated considerable controversy within the village, but that had been justified by her legal counsel on the grounds that her mental state required psychiatric evaluation that could be conducted in a hospital setting more actively than in incarceration. Eleanor had attended the Christmas pageant from a seat in the gallery, positioned where she could observe the proceedings without being obviously prominent. And as the parishioners filed out, Eleanor and Victoria found themselves in proximity to one another for the first time since Eleanor's arrest. What occurred in that moment seemed to Miss Marple to represent something far more significant than a mere social encounter, for Eleanor's face underwent a transformation that suggested the displacement of her carefully constructed narrative by the reality of Victoria's actual presence and continued existence. The abstract grievance that Eleanor had harbored, and that had seemed to justify in Eleanor's mind the commission of premeditated murder, collapsed into confrontation with a living, breathing human being who was Victoria. And in that moment, Eleanor appeared to experience something approaching genuine recognition of what she had intended to do and what she had become through the pursuit of her resentment. Eleanor did not speak to Victoria, nor did Victoria speak to Eleanor, but the exchange of glances between them seemed to Miss Marple to contain more genuine communication than had occurred between them across all the years of their cohabitation at Thornfield Manor. As Miss Marple walked back through the village toward her cottage that evening, she found herself reflecting upon the nature of investigation and detection, and upon the particular satisfaction that arose from the solution of mystery, even when that solution revealed truths that were deeply troubling, and that offered little comfort or closure to those involved. The mystery at Thornfield Manor had been solved, yes, and the danger that Victoria had faced had been neutralized, but the underlying tragedy, the ancient wound that had motivated Eleanor's actions, and the psychological damage that had transformed that wound into murderous intention, remained fundamentally unresolved and likely unresolvable through any mechanism of law or justice that society possessed. Eleanor Hartwell would be tried for her attempted murder, or would be remanded to psychiatric care if the courts determined her incompetent to stand trial, and David would be forced to reconstruct his life in the knowledge of his complicity in his aunt's deceptions and his participation, however reluctant, in her conspiracy. The village of Little Cressington would gradually resume its appearance of peaceful normalcy, would forget or minimize the dark truths that had emerged from within its boundaries, and would continue to present to the world the facade of orderly, respectable community life that characterized so many English villages. Yet for those involved, for Victoria, for David, for Eleanor herself, and for Miss Marple, the experience would remain as a permanent reminder of the fragility of this facade and the profound psychological currents that flowed beneath the surface of apparently civilized existence. As Miss Marple settled into her chair that evening with her knitting needles and her yarn, she found herself considering not the resolution of the mystery, but rather the deeper truths that the investigation had illuminated regarding human nature and the ways in which suffering, unaddressed and unprocessed, could transform individuals into something destructive and fundamentally other than they might otherwise have become. She understood that Eleanor Hartwell had not been born murderous, that something in the circumstances of Eleanor's life, the humiliation she had endured, the powerlessness she had experienced, the decades of resentment that had accumulated without relief or resolution, had gradually constructed a psychological architecture capable of justifying violence and murder. Whether Eleanor's actions represented a failure of Eleanor herself or a failure of the community and the social structures that had failed to provide Eleanor with means of addressing her psychological wounds remained a question that Miss Marple could contemplate but not definitively answer. As the fire crackled in her sitting room and the December wind rattled the windows, Miss Marple found herself returning to her knitting with the steady, meditative rhythm that had characterized her entire life, understanding that this rhythm represented not an avoidance of difficult truths, but rather a fundamental human capacity to continue forward into the future despite the weight of past suffering and the knowledge of human capacity for darkness and destruction.